Hi, welcome to Chapter 14, Lesson 2, as we'll discuss the history of Australia and New Zealand. People have been living in these two areas for a long period of time, and the artifacts that have been discovered, cave paintings, rock art, those types of things, fossils, tell us just how long ago people have come here. Now, there's a little bit of debate on where exactly they came from, but fossil evidence suggests that people came to Australia about 50,000 years ago. Australia is completely surrounded by water, but at this time, much of that water, the ocean, was frozen. And so there would have been ice bridges, land bridges that people could have walked across. If they came from longer distances away, they may have traveled by boat. So people came to Australia. The first people of Australia are called Aboriginal, sometimes called Aborigine. They still live here today. They were hunters and gatherers. They also used weapons like the boomerang pictured here to be able to stun their prey and capture them more easily. Boomerangs can return to you if you throw them well. So the Aboriginal people were the first people that lived there. So they were hunters and gatherers, and they were nomadic. They also had dingoes, so a species of dog that still exists today in Australia. But eventually, kind of like all areas, they began to settle in places and to farm. And just a little bit more information here about the dingo. So the dingo are a free-roaming wild dog. You can see them pictured there. And they usually hunt in packs. And they're kind of one of like about 6 or 7 very well-known mammals that live in Australia, along with like wallabies and kangaroos. Aboriginal culture can take many forms, and there's actually just a lot of different tribes and different languages. There's 400 different languages that exist in Australia, but they also do share many common beliefs. One of the kind of common beliefs that's characteristic of Aboriginal people is this emphasis on dreaming. They call it the dream time, so it's told in song and dance and poetry. The story tells about the spirit ancestors, how they created the world, and dreaming just continues to remain an important part of Aboriginal culture. The other group here, I've always pronounced this Maori, but as I was watching some things, it was saying Maori. So they are the indigenous people of New Zealand. And they came more from like Polynesian islands. So places like Tahiti, those are islands that we're going to talk about in the next chapter, probably coming by boat. One of the things that was really interesting are these large birds called moa that they hunted until extinction. Like the tallest one was like 9 feet tall. You can see from this kind of graph here, those birds, they were flightless. So think very much like an ostrich or an emu, but they were different, I think much larger. They were using those as a part of their diet, and they hunted them till extinction. So in this video here, we might watch this in class one day. It shows how they found the bones of those birds in caves. So the Maori also have this belief of Tinganga. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Tikanga. That's their customs and their belief. Things that are true. I really like this last part here where it says the past is always in front of an individual. So we typically, I think, kind of often think as, the past is behind us, the future is in front, but they kind of have this opposite way of thinking because, your past, your past, what happened to you yesterday, what happened to you 3 years ago. So you can see those more clearly. So that's kind of seen as what's in front of you, but your future is behind you because it is hidden and unknown. Just kind of a very interesting kind of philosophy, I think. So this Tinganga is a part of everyday Maori life. And one of the most important parts of any culture is language. The Maori language almost died out after the British colonized the country. This is very typical of colonization, that languages die out because the group that comes in wants everyone to learn their language. And I know other places, even in the United States, that Native American tribes, some of them have almost lost their language because of that. One of the other things is just tattooing in general. This kind of talks specifically about facial tattooing. Um, if you've watched the movie Moana, you see tattooing in that. It's kind of a different process. It's a very, they would like tap. I think they use tapping to get the needle to make the marks, and then they put this as black soot. I don't know if they do use any kind of ink to make that more permanent. And so tattooing has always been a part of it, rite of passage. Those tattoos all have meaning behind them, even though, this guy's face may look like a bunch of swirls. That has probably a meaning connected to it. So watch the movie Moana, you'll see some of those same kind of things. So this is the section where it really talks about the Europeans coming to these areas, and the Dutch East India Company that we've talked before hired this guy named Abel Tasman, and that's where Tasmania gets its name. So he sailed around the island of Tasmania that's off the coast of Australia. So that's how we get the name for that. So Europeans come. One of the most famous explorers is Captain James Cook. I always kind of pause when I say his name because if you know the enemy in Peter Pan, that's Captain James Hook. So, but this guy is actually real. He really did live. So Captain James Cook, famous explorer. After his voyages, the British government decided to send settlers to the wild lands of Australia. And many of the first colonists didn't have a choice to come there because they were sent as prisoners, because as the prisons were too full in Great Britain, they needed another place to go. So they had to go to prisons in Australia. As many as 160,000 convicts were sent over an 80-year period of time to live in Australia. Beginning in the late 1700s, a settlement formed in Sydney. Sydney today, I think, is the largest city in Australia. There's a couple of really big ones. So Sydney is one of the most well-known ones. There's an opera house there that we'll probably talk about in lesson 3. Gold was discovered to bring in more people yet. And obviously, during colonization, trying to take over, farmland and other resources that exist. The ranchers brought sheep and cattle, creating vast ranches. Today, even sheep herding is a major thing. They would also introduce species like rabbits, which would wreak havoc because they would eat a lot of the grass and other resources available. So introducing species that aren't native to an area can always be kind of a dangerous thing. That's kind of what this slide talks about here. So here we can see the Aboriginal people. Very similar story to what we see in the United States, which is kind of taking over land that belonged to the native people, disease killing off many of them. Not necessarily a really great story here. This kind of, again, talks about Cook reported back, and the land was valuable, so the British began to colonize it. And in the 1840s, the Maori people signed this treaty, handing over their lands. So again, treaties were signed in the United States, kind of very similar to this. And so they lost their lands. Even today, Australia has many businesses, including sheep. The shearing of sheep and probably raising them for food as well are important businesses. In 1901, the 6 British colonies set up in Australia took action to unify as a federation. And so you can see the names of those areas: New South Wales, Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia, South Australia, and Tasmania. So those become the Commonwealth of Australia. And its government today is very similar to Canada, in that it's a blend of US-style federal system with a British-style parliamentary democracy. This talks a little bit about New Zealand and pushing for independence. They would have a little bit of success with that, gaining more independence from Britain. But then we get to this section that talks about, we kind of forget about this, and it's often overlooked in history, but anybody that would have been under the kind of the Great Britain's governmental structure would come to their aid. So many soldiers volunteered and were sent to fight in World War II. And then after World War II, there would be increased independence from Australia, and they would kind of distance themselves from Great Britain. But as we looked at in class, the flag even shows the Union Jack of Great Britain on it. So there is a lot of history there. And also because Australia is not terribly far from Japan, I mean, a lot closer than maybe other places in Europe, some of the areas around Australia were bombed and attacked around the time of Pearl Harbor. So after World War II, Australia became completely independent. New Zealand and Australia kind of started having more closer ties with the United States than Great Britain in many ways. There's been a huge increase in Asian immigration has led to more diversity in Australia. And I also kind of wonder if there's been, it's kind of talked about here, more of a continued return of rights to the Maori people since their lands were taken from them. So we get to this final slide, just a little bit of a recap here. Fossil evidence suggests that humans began migrating to Australia at least 50,000 years ago. The Aboriginal people were the first people to live in Australia. Most of the first European settlers to Australia were convicted criminals from the British Isles. The Maori people were the first to live in New Zealand. Beginning in 1851, people from all over the world traveled to Australia when gold was discovered there. The first people to travel from New Guinea to Australia traveled in small canoes. Australia and New Zealand were pulled into both world wars because they were part of the British Empire and had close ties to them. And finally, the Maori language nearly died out because fewer and fewer people spoke it, even in their own homes. So make sure you write those facts down, and that will conclude lesson 2. Thanks for watching.